Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My name is Caroline Romaguet, and I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Museum of History and the Canadian War Museum. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the museum is located is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. In our honor of the traditional caretakers of the land where our museums are situated, we are working to further incorporate Algonquin history, culture, and perspectives at the museums and have formed an Algonquin Council to help guide us in that work. We also acknowledge the Indigenous territories and caretakers of the lands that we visit, undertake fieldwork, and send our exhibitions. Acknowledging Indigenous rights and working closely with Indigenous communities and partners across Canada is vitally important to the museums as we move forward together in a spirit of collaboration and respect. Today's discussion offers us an important opportunity to reflect upon truth and reconciliation in this country. From grassroots activism to municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal initiatives, people across Canada are embracing the need to acknowledge and to be accountable for some of the darker chapters of our history. It has been almost a decade since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its report and its 94 calls to action. The Commission identified the United Nations declarations as a principle for reconciliation, and Call to Action 43 calls on government to adopt and implement the declaration as a framework for reconciliation. We have taken this to heart here at the museum and have been working over the last 10 years to ensure that our policies and our practices are in line with the UN Declaration and to center Indigenous rights throughout our work. We have made the continuing recognition of Indigenous rights as a strategic direction for the museum and are ensuring we respect decision-making rights of Indigenous people over their cultural heritage while it is in our care. We do that through shared authority agreements and memoranda of understanding, through collaborative projects, community-centered exhibitions, and through repatriation. We know that as a national memory institution, it is our responsibility to tell the truths about Canadian history. We will continue to do that through our exhibitions and programs on residential schools, through working closely with Indigenous communities and ensuring survivors have a platform to tell their stories. And it is our shared responsibility to listen, to bear witness to these stories, and work towards a better future. We are grateful for the work we have done with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation over the years. The NCTR is a place of learning and dialogue where truth of the residential school experience will be honored and kept safe for future generations. We are also proud to have shared a number of initiatives designed to explore Indigenous perspectives on residential schools, and we look forward to future opportunities to collaborate and work alongside NCTR for ongoing learning and healing. And I'd like to thank you also for holding this event at the National Museum, at the Canadian Museum of History. I have no doubt that today's discussion will be informative and thought-provoking, and that it will further advance the conversation around truth and reconciliation in this country. I would now like to hand things over to Kayla Johnston from the NCTR. Kayla is Director of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming. Kayla?
Thank you, Caroline, for that wonderful introduction. Before we begin, I wanted to provide a little bit more information about Truth and Reconciliation Week, and more specifically about the Adult Education Lunch and Learns, as well as the format for today's event. Truth and Reconciliation Week began in 2020 as a single day's worth of virtual programming for students grades 1 to grade 12. Since its inception, Truth and Reconciliation Week has grown to encompass a full week's worth of virtual programming for students, in addition to the live student empowerment event, the September 30th national broadcast, and the adult education content. Last year in 2023, we hosted 5 adult education lunch and learns to address the gap as well as the hunger for education on the history and legacy and impacts of the residential school system, as well as reconciliation. We had over 40,000 views to the program on Zoom, in addition to our YouTube channel. Due to the excess of last year's program, we are hosting 5 Lunch and Learns this year with a variety of speakers from September 23rd to the 27th. Topics to be addressed this year include a look at the health impacts of colonial systems, unconscious bias and stereotyping and allyship, Indigenous identity fraud, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and addressing the barriers to reconciliation. This year's program is being presented with generous support from Enbridge as well as the Canadian Public Health Association. As you will have noticed, today's session is a hybrid event with both an in-person audience joining us at the Museum of History, as well as a virtual audience joining from Zoom webinar, as well as our NCTR YouTube page. Unfortunately, we had an error occur and we are unable to provide the ASL LSQ interpretation today. However, all of the sessions are being recorded and the ASL LSQ will be added at a later date to be accessible on our NCTR YouTube page, along with the French audio interpretation also being provided today. Now, after I conclude my remarks, I'm going to be turning things over to Sherri Helgason, our moderator, to introduce our panelists and lead a roundtable discussion for the next 45 minutes, followed by an in-person Q&A. At around roughly 2:20 time here in Ottawa, I will return to the podium to conclude the event with some information about September 27th Lunch and Learn session and the September 30th programming on Parliament Hill. Now with that, I would like to introduce Sherri, who will be our moderator for today's session. Sherri Helgason is the Director of Governance and Reporting with the UN Declaration Act Implementation Secretariat at Justice Canada. Her background is in the human rights field, having worked with the Canadian Human Rights Commission for over 30 years. She began her career starting as an investigator with the Commission in Manitoba in 1991 and has worked in numerous positions and locations with the Human Rights Commission since that time, including as Regional Director of BC and the Yukon Regional Office in the late 1990s, as well as the Director of Investigation in Ottawa from 2000 to 2006, and as Director of the Commission's National Aboriginal Initiative from 2007 to 2017. In 2018, Sherri returned to the management of the Commission's complaints function to help address a growing backlog before being enticed to move to Justice in late 2021 to work on the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Sherri is of Anishinaabe and Icelandic heritage from Manitoba with roots in Sandy Bay Ojibwe First Nation in Treaty 1 territory. With that, I pass it to Sherri and our 2 panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla, I'm sorry. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation's Lunch and Learn session on community perspectives on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So again, thank you for the kind introduction and thank you to the museum for hosting us. As mentioned, my name is Sherri Helgason and I'm the Director of Governance and Reporting with the UN Declaration Act Implementation Secretariat at the Department of Justice. My pronouns are she and her. For those who cannot see me, I'm a somewhat fair-skinned woman with white and blonde hair, and I'm wearing a white suit with an orange ribbon on my lapel. I'm from Treaty 1 territory in what we now call Winnipeg, but I'm pleased to be joining you here on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people at the beautiful Museum of History. I encourage all of you joining today to reflect on the traditional lands from whence you're watching this session and on the Indigenous people's long-standing presence on and contribution to these lands. Permit me, as your moderator today, to set the stage a little for this panel discussion. I'd like to begin by recognizing the more than 25 years of collaboration between United Nations member states and Indigenous peoples from around the world, including Indigenous leaders from Canada, which led to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a comprehensive international human rights instrument. How a country chooses to implement the UN Declaration, as we commonly refer to it, depends on each country's unique circumstances. The Government of Canada decided to take a legislative approach, and on June 21st, 2021, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act was adopted by Parliament and came into force federally. The UN Declaration Act sets out 3 obligations on the federal government, all to be carried out in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. Section 5 requires the government to take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of Canada are consistent with the UN Declaration. Section 6 requires the government to develop and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the declaration. And Section 7 requires the preparation of annual progress reports, which must be tabled in both houses of Parliament every year. The Government of Canada worked in consultation and cooperation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis for 2 years to develop an action plan that reflects their vision for a better future for generations to come. Since the action plan was released on June 21st, 2023, we have now shifted our focus towards making the objectives of the UN Declaration a reality. We are so far the only country in the world to have a UN Declaration action plan at the federal level. The successful implementation of the UN Declaration Act and the action plan is vital to advancing reconciliation and promoting and protecting the human rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and each of us has a role to play. We are pleased to have the chance to speak today with 2 Indigenous leaders who have been involved in building a better future for Indigenous peoples, and in doing so, a more inclusive Canada. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed panelists for this event. First, I would like to introduce Marilyn Buffalo. Marilyn was born and raised on Samson Cree Nation. She's 74 years old. You would never know that, Marilyn. And brings mature, experienced leadership and is a recognized voice in many circles. She has over 55 years of community development experience in northern, isolated, urban, and rural Indigenous communities and internationally. That work has taken her into political, social, health, and economic affairs, dealing with education, adult literacy, employment and training, language rights, sports and recreation, justice, law, veterans, women, child welfare, youth and elders' rights, land rights, economic and business development. Marilyn has sought justice for residential school survivors for decades. Her current focus is on the educational and cultural developmental needs of Indigenous women, children, and youth. Marilyn also served as president of the Native Women's Association of Canada from 1997 to the year 2000. Welcome, Marilyn. Megan Lewis is a young, queer, mixed Gunyangahaga, I hope I have that pronunciation right, Megan, or Mohawk woman, and is a member of the Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. As the director of the Center for Indigenous Policy and Research at Indigenous Youth Roots, she focuses on engaging Indigenous youth in policy and research by creating more accessible spaces to create and advocate for impactful and meaningful change. So welcome, Megan. Welcome to you both. We have a few questions ready to get the ball rolling on discussion for this panel, following which, provided we have the time, we'll open the floor to questions from the live audience in this room. My first question is for both of you, and I would direct it to you first, Marilyn. I'm interested in your personal history with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As you'll know, the Declaration was decades in the making, and Indigenous leadership from Canada had a crucial role in its development and adoption by the United Nations. So how did you first become aware of the Declaration, and what kind of an impact has it had? So Marilyn, if we could start with you.
Thank you. First, I'd like to acknowledge our Creator for bringing us all together this wonderful day. I also want to acknowledge my ancestors, whom were Cree leaders in the hereditary governance system of the Cree peoples, the Cree nation. And so I became aware. Oh, I also wish to acknowledge Dr. Wilton Littlechild, who is our international chief for Treaty 6, who spearheaded many of these discussions. I've known Dr. Wilton Littlechild all of my life. I believe he was already in university at University of Alberta playing hockey, and I was still in junior high. So we've been raised by the same ancestors, in the same language, the same culture. And so Wilton, I was at 1976, I was the advisor on Native Affairs to the University of Alberta and established all of the programming, Indigenous programming on campus. I was 25 years old, and Wilton was in law school. So by this time, we're already pretty seasoned in our traditional knowledge and the instructions as they were handed to us by our ancestors. And our last day of Wilton's law exam, I remember this day because I was pregnant with my son, Joe Buffalo. And I could barely fit in Dr. Wilton Littlechild's Firebird sports car. And we drove in this hot day to my nation, Musqueam, because the elders had called us. And we went into a ceremony. And the instructions are very simple in English. But if you understand my language and our ceremonial practice, you would understand that it's very complex. And that if we believe that we are sovereign nations, which we are, the Musqueam Cree is combined of 4 nations, Samson, Ermineskin, Louis, Bow, Montana, Cree, that we have a right as signatories to the treaties of 1876, that as nations we have a right to our own self-determination. And so that day that we went to Musqueam was when the ceremonial instructions were given. I was not in the sweat lodge, but I remember hearing very carefully the songs and the instructions. And so we had a feast afterwards. And that is, if we believe we are nations, then we must join hands with other nations in other continents, other indigenous nations of Africa, South Pacific, Asia, and the Nordic countries, every continent globally, so that we join hands with our brothers and sisters, and that we will come together at the United Nations. Since then, that's almost 50 years. Canada acknowledged it took a while. We'll give them credit for it, for passing their legislation. But the real work has to be done. So with that, that's when I became first familiar with. But we have to know that my instructions began at birth and childhood, because I was instructed from the time I could remember, my great-grandmother, who schooled me in my language, and all of the traditional knowledge that was passed on to me. Treaties was number 1 on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And it's inspiring to know how much the rights and principles in the UN Declaration, in fact, started many, many years earlier, before even its adoption at the United Nations, and started in ceremony. So thank you for sharing that history with us. Allow me to turn the question to you, Megan. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first became aware of the UN Declaration?
Yeah, so this morning my sister and I were talking about this, and I was just starting grade 7 in 2007, and so I didn't really become aware in kind of the terms of actually talking about the UN Declaration, especially in Canada, because as you said, Marilyn, they were a little bit slow to adopt it and to implement it, but in high school, I think that's when the conversation slowly started. And in particular, I had a couple of good high school teachers, especially actually here in Ottawa, who were more adamant about talking about policy and politics. And I was really interested in having those conversations, and went to the United Nations model United Nations in New York in high school. And so that was one of those early conversations. But the real work for me and how it impacted me really started, I think, more towards when I started university. And I became really interested on my end, working more on the front lines, seeing how policy was impacting community, but it was being created often by folks who weren't understanding how it was impacting folks on the ground. And so I pivoted a little bit in my career to try and understand more about policy. And so I started getting more involved in policy. And for a little while there, I worked with the federal government, but I wanted to connect back to community. And that's when I started getting really interested, in particular, in the declaration, but more so in the process of how wider systems and movements can impact change. And so that's a little bit how it connects to the work that I do now with Indigenous Youth Roots. And no matter what conversations we have at our organization, specifically through the department that I oversee, which is the Center for Indigenous Policy and Research, we frequently talk to Indigenous youth about what drives them, what they're passionate about. And often when we talk about policy, sometimes it doesn't always connect. And so we've really started talking about policy as a tool for advocacy, as a way to really connect all of these kinds of processes that are sometimes have intentionally excluded Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous young people. And I think that's really relevant when talking about the UN Declaration and how we want to move that forward and make sure that the priorities that Indigenous young people and Indigenous people in general, how they can make sure that their voices are heard in those processes. So policy as a tool for advocacy has become something that's incredibly important in the day-to-day work that we do in our department. And I think that even though it wasn't something that was very involved kind of in my childhood, because it wasn't quite there yet. Now it's something that comes up in conversation every single day, and it's something that I'm very, very passionate about, making sure that the engagements that we have with the young people continue to be relevant, and that the advocacy that we do and that the youth want to push forward continue to be really relevant.
Thank you, Megan. Okay, that's very interesting how you touch on how advocacy influences policy and policy influences advocacy. And that kind of brings me to another question, in fact, for both of you. And it's about the action plan, and I like having props, so I'm holding up a copy of the UN Declaration Act action plan for folks. So I'd like to ask you about your thoughts on the impacts of the action plan that was developed in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples as part of the implementation of the federal UN Declaration Act. It touches on a number of areas across, well, many of the rights and principles that are reflected in the UN Declaration itself. Which of the 181 action plan measures, or which area of the action plan, do you think has the greatest potential to have results and to result in real lasting change on the ground in Indigenous communities and for Indigenous peoples? What are your ideas for meaningfully implementing these commitments? So I'd turn this question to Megan first, and then I'll ask you as well, Marilyn, to comment on what you think is most important in the action plan.
Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, I think when we're talking about something that ideally is informed by community, it's hard to identify something that is the most important or likely to have the most impactful change. But I think from an organizational perspective in particular, what we can appreciate about the action plan is that each measure is assigned to a specific ministry with the federal government, because one of the most important things that we heard from youth when we did an engagement leading up to the implementation or the development of the action plan is that accountability is so important in order for youth to start to build trust that the action plan will ultimately be implemented. And having there be action plans assigned to ministries, that helps to encourage some level of accountability, hopefully long term. In terms of action plan measures that we think kind of have more of a promise for systemic change, when we have conversations with young people, having specific measures that implement existing recommendations that came out of extensive consultations, for example, like the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and also those that bolster TRC recommendations, are really important, because this is something that we've heard from youth over the years as well, that a lot of these things we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's been so many conversations over the past decades from communities, from elders, that they know what needs to happen for there to be systemic change. We don't have to continue to try and do something different, because what's already been suggested hasn't been tried yet. And so I think there being action plan measures that reinforce these really important conversations that have been had already with community, and making sure that those voices are kind of more put in stone in the action plan, is really crucial to make sure that those voices through these different, such as the TRC, are really kind of reinforced as something that we're hoping to see move forward. And seeing it in multiple different ways and different facets hopefully will mean that there's going to be more investments. And in that way, I certainly do mean financial investments to make sure that these things can be actually implemented. Also being kind of encouraged to see distinction-based action plan measures that are focused on cross-jurisdictional issues, because I think something that is a really significant barrier that young people talk about a lot, and that we see, is that youth are tired, and they see their communities really tired of seeing things being slowed down by jurisdictional disputes. Things that are maybe a responsibility of a municipal government or a provincial government or territorial or federal, and that being a reason to not push forward change. And so in lieu of that, hoping to see that there's the ability to address these concerns cross-jurisdictionally, to kind of shed light on the importance of these still moving forward regardless of who's responsible for them. Kind of further, that there are issues that can specifically disproportionately impact Indigenous youth, and hoping that these action plan measures also commit departments to working alongside communities to make sure that these reforms can actually take root and be carried out in a smooth way.
Thank you, Megan. I think you've highlighted some important issues there. The accountability, like the fact that in the action plan, there are specific departments that are associated with measures, so there's an accountability mechanism there, and the importance of amplifying what's already been said through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for justice, and the implications cross-jurisdictionally among other insights that you shared. Thank you, Megan. I'll turn the same question to you, Marilyn, about the action plan, and what in it do you see that is of greatest importance to carry forward?
Thank you. I'm always a little nervous about truth-telling, because I've spent my life telling truth and have paid big price. I've never been privileged, even though I've aspired to high offices in my time. And I say to every person that's listening, we can do better. We will do better. And why I say that is because I see that the action plan is focused on modern day treaty process and not on the treaty, existing treaties. Some people call historic treaties, pre-Confederation treaties, and treaties 1 to 11, which span across this country. And we've won every Supreme Court decision in my lifetime, and we will continue to do so because we are title holders, we are sovereign nations, we sign treaties, because without those treaties, it would be a different Canada. There would be no Canada, and that's a fact. And the history books have to reiterate that and do it right, get it right. So we must do better. And so to Canada, I say, you must know who we are. You must learn from us because you'll never get it right unless you do. And we need to more focus on the original spirit and intent because we never gave up our titles. We didn't give up. Nobody's that crazy that they would hand over everything, including the rights to the resources, and that we have our rights to our own spirituality, which was taken from us, and we fought to keep what we have. We also have our treaty rights to traditional healing methods, of which is very much in practice in our nations, and which means ceremonial practice. The songs, the dance is very much intact. And we also have a right to develop our own institutions, our own colleges and universities based on our culture and language and ceremonial natural laws. We also have our rights to our own hospitals, our own health care, and schools. I've always believed that, which is why I entered into the field of community development. And as instructed by my elders, thank God I don't have a criminal record, but I've been known to demonstrate in my life and will continue to do so. I say no apologies were given for what was taken from us, because what has happened here, the Indian residential school, which is what I'm a product of, as the system itself has reformed into a child welfare system and has not gone away, but it's multiplied into different jurisdictions and different laws across this country. And so again, we're having to restate our right to raise our children and our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. I have 13 great-grandchildren, and we'll have 14 in come February. We have the highest population of young people in our nations. Well, it's increasing. General population, youth population is not as growing as fast. So it makes sense, and I say this to many, many prime ministers since as far back as I can remember. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Jean Chrétien, all of these prime ministers, we've said Paul Martin, who was Minister of Finance, the cutbacks are going to kill our people. And it has. Statistically speaking, we don't have to raise the bar in knowing that we become the most vulnerable population in our own country. and that's not acceptable. So my investment would be, in all of that I've said, is to invest in our youth. Our children should be in Harvard if they wish to go there, if they wish to go to trade school, and there should be no quota with all the mining resources that has been taken out of our territory as we speak. And so in sports, recreation, business development. But I also say to the young people that are listening, whether you be Indigenous or non-Indigenous or new Canadians, I'll say learn from us, because we remind you that we inherited our trauma, we continue to heal our traumas, but we remind you that we are strong, powerful Indigenous nations with powerful culture, languages, and the inherent right. And I say to all new Canadians, I want to teach you. Indigenous women, our traditional role is to teach and to heal. And we should be teaching all new Canadians on what it's like to be on Indigenous land in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And you've touched on some really important areas. Oh, and you're receiving applause from within the room for those who are joining online. You've touched on some important areas, the importance of the treaty relationship, the importance of investing in our youth, and the importance of teaching everyone, including new Canadians. And that kind of leads me to another question, Marilyn. And so I'd like to direct this one to you. You have been working for the advancement of the rights of Indigenous women for literally decades. I recall meeting you over 20 years ago when you were championing a human rights case that, as I believe you were successful in, and you were also president of the Native Women's Association of Canada at a crucial time. I'm sure you've faced your fair share of resistance and pushback along the way from time to time. And it's fair to say that there has been resistance and pushback in respect of the UN Declaration itself as well. So can you share some advice with us? How were you able to overcome obstacles or resistance? Are there any particular moments that stick out to you where you won people over? And what advice would you have for people who are fighting to advance Indigenous rights in the face of resistance today?
Wow. I have to write a book. Does anybody have a grant for a grandmother that wants to write their, as told? I could be cooperative with you too. You could be my as told too. Good grief. I'm the head of a large family. I'm the oldest of 11 children. I have now alive 7 brothers. So I had the privilege of having great parenting. I recently lost my mother at the end of July. And after 6 years as CEO of Nietzsche Institute, where we trained addiction counselors and therapists nationwide, I've resigned from that position because I am going to get my voice back. Does that sound good? Are we going to join hands and kick a little butt? But we could have fun at the same time, right? I know all the good spots. If you want to go camping across any continent, I have a network of weird, wonderful women in this country, and not all of them are Indigenous. And I've chaired the Indigenous Women's Forum at the United Nations. I also have sisters in other continents. And I've also chaired the Indigenous Women of the Americas. And I don't speak Spanish or French, but I am sure some of you do. And from that goes, projects. Now, when you're initiating something new, you're going to get resistance. And more often than not, the answer is no. So I'm like that little child in boarding school, and I challenge Sister Superior, and I drive her crazy because I speak my language fluently, and she's forbid me from speaking my language. She's talking to the other staff, other nuns, clergy in French, very poor French, I might add, and teaching me very poor English. All the English that I've learned from my mother, who taught me how to read before I went to grade 1. But the traditional knowledge that I gained from my great grandmother is money in the bank. And so when some person says no, you have to be really creative. And this is where policy analysis is very key, is that you have to find new ways, new language, and a new approach to establishing what it is you want. Because if someone says no to me, that sounds like 100 challenges right there. So go back and study and regroup and gain colleagues, experts. It's a little bit like going to court. You get expert witnesses or intelligence. You gather intelligence as you go. But you never accept no as an answer. Because what would be the point? You might as well stay in bed or not even bother. Like go study, I don't know, astronomy. Or even there you'd have problems because you'd need to come back to Indigenous elders and ask, what do they know about astronomy, right? And my job has always been to work with young people and coach. And I've lost count of all the people that I've helped to write their PhD theses, dissertations. I'm not bragging, because one of the most memorable one, you asked me who, which one sticks out most? My friend, Dr. Mary Apt, who is a psychiatric nurse, ahead of a psychiatric hospital in Western Canada. And she was my friend since I was 13 years old. How could we be a friend of an adult woman at that, a nurse? She came from McGill University. She married just adjoining our reservation, and she was Irish Catholic, and she came to our church. And I was in junior high when I met her. And so there began this lifelong friendship. And I spoke at her, at her funeral and so on. But Dr. Mary Apt did her doctorate in leadership, on leadership. And so she said, you need to help me. I said, okay, whatever. I bring the books, whatever. And everything I read was so boring. And why do you even bother with this? And I mean, binders and binders of every week she'd be dropping this stuff off. And I said, you white people are so boring. Why do you keep repeating the same thing using different words? And it turns out, she said, and the greatest compliment I ever got, she said, you know more about change than anybody I've ever met. And I was just a kid. I was a young mother at 35. Now, why am I telling you this story? Is because you learn to understand why people resist change. What is it in their makeup, their personality, their psyche that makes them so they feel they want to be powerfully dominant all the time? What is up with that? And then my mother would say, it's a superiority complex, right? But to be facetious, and she was really quite intelligent, my mother. Because, you know, it's a clash of two worlds, or many worlds. But the challenge is, and I say this to anybody that's listening, I'm assuming that you attend today's event because you really care. There's something in your heart, your intrigue, your mind that makes you want to learn more. But you have to learn from us. You cannot learn it from a book. That's a good starter. There are good authors and publishers out there, but you have to learn like I did with my friend Dr. Mary Apt. And later on, as time went, we established healing circles. She facilitated because she was a psychiatric nurse. And everyone in our family, before she died, she impacted probably about 300-400 lives. And we could even do a study to find out how many of those that she impacted went on to higher learning and university. How many of them did escape child abuse and domestic violence? You know, and their children as a result did very well. And I am one of those. I can openly testify to that anytime. I'm not afraid. And because of her guidance, it helped me to deal with, and also I in turn helped her. I converted her. She, towards the end of her life, I would say 10 years of her life, attended ceremonies and fasted with us and went to our sweat lodges and our funerals and so on. And she said, your people are so civilized. Even when a person dies, you honor. You have 3-4 days of ceremonies. And in our culture, we just have 1 hour service, goodbye, and that's it. That's not healthy. So when you start comparing the two worlds, it is healthy. I think for me, I've been a single mother for 40 years. I've never had an easy or a partner say, here, or a supportive, emotionally supportive mate. And if you have that, that's money in the bank too. But if you aspire to greatness, you must be balanced. You must be healthy. I have a hard time finding people that keep up to me as I'm walking 8-10 miles a day at my age. And I wake up 4:15 every morning. I don't need an alarm clock or anybody to tell me what needs to be done first. So I think discipline, aspiration to high hopes, keep a diary, write down your goals. January 1st, I'm going to accomplish this year. This is what I will do. And find some good comrades. Thank you. Oh, be sober and stay away from that evil drugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. So in addition to what you've just mentioned about being balanced and healthy and being disciplined, what I heard in your response was like, don't take no for an answer. Be creative. Develop your networks. You mentioned having networks of women, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous across the world. Listen to elders, listen to the people, and understand what is behind the resistance to change. Thank you, Miigwech, for that response, Marilyn. Megan, I'd like to turn to you. And I'd like to hear more about the youth voice going forward. Your organization has often said that Indigenous youth would like to see change in their lifetimes. From an Indigenous youth perspective, what does improvement and progress look like with respect to what UN Declaration implementation? What are some of the key indicators or measures of progress that would help Indigenous youth see this transformative change in their lifetimes?
Yeah, I just definitely want to start by saying thank you for sharing it. It reminds me of anytime we run any engagements or listen to youth, one of the first things we think of is making sure we always have elders present to make sure that we have a grounded space. And the most important thing for us is always listening to stories and learning from elders. And it's a recurring theme that we always hear, because just like you said, learning from elders and folks in our communities who have that knowledge and have so much to teach us is something that's so important, especially to youth. And that youth elder relationship is something that is so important to all the young people that we engage with. And I think it ties really closely to this question that you're asking in terms of kind of what does progress look like, because when we did our first really large UNDRIP engagement with youth in 2022, where we did kind of more intimate engagements with over 200 youth, one youth in particular said, and it's a quote, that they won't believe that implementing UNDRIP is successful until they see their community or communities around them having a better quality of life, and that they want to see actual changes rather than another data report. So progress and quality of life for Indigenous youth, it can look a lot of different ways. And for a lot of youth, it's about things as simple as not having to be forced to leave their communities unless they want to, for things like education, not even just university, but for high school, or to get work. It's about having access to clean water, transportation, stable internet, to be able to have access to healthcare system navigators, have access to funding and supports when they age out of child welfare. And importantly, like other Indigenous communities, Indigenous youth voices are not singular like all Indigenous people, and their identities are multifaceted, and their needs depend on many factors like gender, able-bodiedness, where they live. And so there's a need to be really intersectional when setting metrics and measuring progress at a hyper-localized level as well. And I think one of the things about UNDA implementation is sometimes it's not accessible to have those conversations with youth. Not everyone knows what UNDRIP is. And I think that there's this misconception that, especially if you work in these spaces all the time, that if you say UNDRIP, people are immediately going to be on the same page as you, that they know what that is. But if we're trying to make it something that's accessible and that we're able to have a conversation about, and we can talk about how it maybe is having progress at a community level and at a way that, and understanding how it impacts folks on a day-to-day, we have to make the language accessible. We have to talk about it in a way, especially when we're talking about the act and the action plan and the actual implementation of it, to talk about how that actually relates to people's day-to-day lives, even though if we're in it and we work in those spaces, we may understand how it does. But if we want to make sure that everybody can be involved, having more conversations about that in a way that is more relatable and more relevant, and that's a really important conversation that we have when engaging with youth, is asking questions and talking about progress in a way that is just more, I guess, more personable, more conversational with young people. And I think no matter what conversation that we're having with youth, you can tie it back to UNDRIP. You can tie every conversation back to it because it's such a high level conversation that everything falls under that conversation. And I think storytelling is a really big part of that, because even if you don't ask a specific question related to indicators or key metrics, and you just ask someone to tell you about what empowerment means to them, or how healthy is their community, or an example of what relationships, strong relationships in their community look like, you're getting metrics about UNDRIP. A good example of how we kind of empower storytelling in data is this year. Recently, actually just a couple weeks ago, we finished one of the largest Indigenous youth-led research projects nationally, that's coming out October 30th, where we engaged with over 1,000 Indigenous youth to talk specifically about this. So how Indigenous youth envision their futures, and at every level. So talking to them about this in relation to culture, wellness, education, work, and that in a very Indigenous way. So not necessarily work as we might refer to it in the 9 to 5, but work, a lot of youth referred to the trap line, not working in terms of going into the office, but having seasonal work so that they could go back to their communities, so that they could stay in their communities, and making sure that they could have and be a part of healthy sovereign nations, where everyone had access to what they need beyond the bare necessities of clean water and safe housing. Because I think people forget too that sometimes they might be talking about things that is hard to have conversations about before you have your basic needs met, which is a conversation that a lot of people are still having. And so through this research that we did, what youth were looking for included things like abundant and accessible elder supports, addiction services, community centers, language learning programs, Indigenous-led education facilities and healthcare facilities, which you mentioned too. And it also meant communities that are rooted in their traditional teachings and systems of governance. And these are conversations that Indigenous youth are having about meaningful futures. And these are also conversations that they're talking about that have come from conversations they've had with their families and their elders and in their communities for decades. And so in addition to outlining what they want for their futures, youth also made it clear that what they're working to leave in the past. And this includes barriers to keep them and other youth and future youth from connecting with their communities and culture, such as lateral violence, lack of accountability, homophobia and transphobia, and anti-Black racism, to name a few. And Indigenous youth are really committed to building futures where no one's forced to leave their communities, as mentioned. And for us, these are all indicators that we can track to see progress that's happening, and all tie back to UNDRIP as well.
Excellent. Fantastic, Megan. A lot in there in your answer around making language accessible to youth, storytelling, talking about these concepts in a way that is relevant to the lives of the people that we work with and are there to serve. And you get the metrics from that. I liked your point there. And some of what you talked about how Indigenous youth envision their futures and what they want to leave in the past is very cogent and relates to another question that I would like to ask you. But I do note that we have now reached 2 o'clock, and it's at this point where we had wanted to take a little pause to see if there's any questions in the audience for our panelists. So with that, I would invite anyone in the audience who has questions for Marilyn or for Megan to please let us know. And I would ask that you identify yourself, that if you have a question, you speak clearly and slowly enough that our translators can follow you, and so our panelists can hear you. And as I say, I'd also ask if you could let us know whether your question is for Marilyn or Megan or both. So with that, do I see, it's hard to see through the lights, do I see any questions in the audience? No question. Do I see it? I see 2 hands, three hands, 2 hands. Okay, so I understand we have a traveling microphone. I saw 1 hand over here and then 1 up there right in the middle.
Bonjour, je vais parler en français, c'est correct de m'exprimer en français, or should I? Oui, j'y vais. Okay. Hi, I can also speak English. I was just not sure. My name is Emily Lemieux. I would like to thank you all for this amazing share today. My question is for Elder Marilyn. Sorry about that. Pardon? I was really interesting when you said that the old treaties wasn't put into place at the moment, if I understood correctly. And like, what is the major obstacle for those to be respected today, as you can see it from your point of view?
So if I understand correctly, what is the major obstacle
Yeah.
in having the treaties, the historic treaties,
yes.
respected today
Thank
in
you.
Canada?
Oui.
The major obstacle is the refusal to see us as sovereign nations. Does that make sense? And that resistance, the barriers are insurmountable. But it's not going to go away. I'm a direct descendant of Big Bear on my mother's side and Pound Maker on my dad's side, direct. So my oral history, my oral tradition is we think of those treaties, we talk about them as if they happened yesterday. They're not going to go away. Because when those treaties were signed and negotiated, oh, by the way, both my ancestors, Big Bear and Pound Maker, read the stories. Canada jailed my ancestors. Stony Mountain Penitentiary. So there's history there. Why did they do that? Because there would be a holy war in the prairies had they not done that. And there was a very tense time in history at that time. But when we talk about the spirit and intent of the treaty, the law, the covenant, a sacred covenant, was between two nations and our Creator. So when you sign like a marriage contract relationship, you have a blessing from the Creator. There's a third party upstairs. So you cannot, there's nobody greater than God, Creator, Allah, however you wish to acknowledge. That's a sacred covenant. And it's not going to go away. So the best thing to do is treat it with respect, learn from it, and move on together. And then there's, up here, we have wampum belt treaties, the Mi'kmaq treaties, pre-Confederation treaties. We also had internation treaties, the Crees with the Mi'kmaq, the Mohawk, and so on. This country was built on our resources, the fur industry, the Hudson's Bay. And you look at Canada's map, right, from east to west. You go, the highways where the rivers were the highways, the waterways. Everywhere you go, you have Fort Severn, Fort Saskatchewan, Fort Edmonton, Fort, Rocky Mountain House to house, like every place. And that were the trading post. And it was our people that built this country based on the fur industry, just that alone. But we traded with each other as well. I know this because it was taught to me by my great-grandmother before I went to school. And so it's easy for me to understand when I hear the Mohawk Nation, my brothers there saying, I have a treaty right to govern my own taxation, my own gaming and tobacco. No nation has a right to tax another nation. You think about that concept, and it's real today. And we live under the Indian Act legislation. When we had our own hereditary system of governance, our own child welfare system, our own educational system, you name it, before the white man came. And they came there and imposed legislation, apartheid, on my people. And that Indian Act legislation is patrilineal, which means it's male dominant. And they did that all over the world. In Africa, they did it in India, you name it, they have a caste system in India. Central South America. And then over here in our nations, traditionally, we are matrilineal. In other words, it's the mothers, the women that govern. They decide who's going to become hereditary chief. And they pass on the knowledge, the wisdom, and the language to their children and their grandchildren. That's our role as healers and mothers, and to teach all the time. So when that system was broken, it was broken by our right as mothers was taken away when our children were taken from us. Imagine you have a child, and at the age of 6, they're taken, and you don't see them for another 10 years. And they come back to you, they speak a foreign language. They don't know your custom, your behavior, your language. Imagine that. What would you do? How would you rebuild your family? And chances are you won't have a family left. And I seen this. I left my community when I was 15 years old. I thought when I left my community I left my culturally safe environment. In my culture, in the ceremonies, everything was taken. I went to an all white school. By the way, I graduated valedictorian in all white school, okay? I did my bit. Mind you, I got grounded a few times, but that's, you know. But when I never saw so much dysfunctional behavior, and so is having an affair with this one over there, this one. Oh my goodness, I went into culture shock. So when I gave my presentation, in my valedictorian presentation, I said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a strong Indian leader in this country because I've learned to understand you white people. I didn't say that because I was racist. I said that because it's the truth. And I said, I'm going to write my book about you, your community, and it's going to put Peyton Place to shame. Peyton Place was a soap opera at the time. Anybody that's my age will understand. understand. But it's true. It was a cultural clash for me because it was in a foreign, like I had entered a foreign country that was very non-supportive. And I didn't have access to my parents. At a very tender age of teenagehood, I didn't have my parental guidance and my cultural supports. So for me, that's why I advocate for young people. And it's very, very tough to work with young people, particularly those that have been adopted away. But if you've lived that experience, like I've never been adopted, but when you've experienced culture shock, you know how to relate to them. And so I've adopted many children from many cultures in my lifetime, all from across the world. And my father is the same thing. My father, who died a year and a half ago, he has a son at East Indian. And we laugh because, you know, when my father passed away, Dr. Wilton Littlechild came and gave a presentation because of the role that my dad played in his life, and that his father was in military as well. And he said that going on a hockey trip with my dad was like a history lesson, and because he would know all the place names in Cree as they were driving. And I think it's so important, you know, when you acknowledge the elders, you don't realize elders is not just for us Indigenous people. You have elders in your culture too. But it's just, how do you incorporate them into your daily life, in your learning, your family life as well? Are they included in part of that? If not, then you have some work to do there. Both parties have some work to do. My dad's funeral, full gospel were there. The minister, who was a chief, was there. The Mormons came. The Hutterites were named honorary pallbearers. The Chinese, and I have an East Indian brother my dad adopted. And at his feast, we had East Indian food, buttered chicken and all this good stuff. But why am I telling you this? It's because it's possible to raise all of you and your families in a healthy United Nations environment without giving up any of your power and your intelligence, your spirit, and all of the good stuff. It's free. You just have to learn to open your doors. I open my teepee, I let you in. And that's what, spiritually, that's what it's all about. And it's fun, okay? You don't have to feel, you know. The greatest gift I ever gave my children was to come to live in Ottawa for 15 years. And they learned. I have children in Tanzania that I've adopted that are now working in the high-tech industry. I have a son who's a rabbi. You know, and all of these weird, wonderful things that have happened. But that's what the UN Declaration is all about. Don't be afraid to make friends. I can be mean and ugly first thing in the morning, you know, but by noon I've done a day's work. So if you want to hang out in the afternoon, I'm there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. You've taken us through a discussion on the importance of the treaty relationship, to the Indian Act and residential schools, to the principles of the UN Declaration today and how we can all live together. I think we may have time for one more question, and I had seen a hand up right in the middle over here. And I note that it is 2:15, so I'm afraid we'll have we have about 5 minutes left before we have to hand it back to Kayla. So With that, may I ask you to ask your question?
Yes, hi, my name is Michael. I don't know if I'm going to stand just because I don't want to block the camera. My question is for both of our wonderful speakers, and I'm just wondering what advice you would have for a young public servant who wants to support Indigenous peoples and communities on the path of reconciliation.
Lovely. So the question was, what advice would our panelists have for young public servants who would like to support the path of reconciliation in their work going forward? Did I get that right? Okay. Um, Megan, did you want to take a crack at that one first?
Sure. I'll try and be super quick. I think for one, it definitely depends on the type of work you do, but if you engage with communities, I think the number one piece of advice that we give, our team does a lot of presentations on meaningful engagement with community. And I think the number one thing that we always say is to never just engage when you need something, to always start relationships meaningfully, always just with the purpose of building relationships. And that's always so important because relationships are really at the center of everything that we do. And I think when you're building relationships and engaging with community, if you already have that foundation, the trust is there. And I think that's what lacks so significantly, especially with government, between government and community, for a million reasons I won't go into. But I think in terms of engagement, that's always our number one piece of advice, is to start those relationships and maintain them, and have that be a part of the work that you do, and really advocate for that to be an ongoing piece of the role that you have. And to continuously educate yourselves as well. I think that that's the responsibility that everybody has, especially given whatever type of work that you do. I think obviously there's a really wide range. I know that we're really low on time, but our team, like I said, does presentations. We're always happy to do more. So you're welcome to find me on LinkedIn and we can connect. And I'm happy to give a longer answer on this as well. We're always happy to continue to kind of have that conversation on an ongoing basis, because I think depending on what specific work you do, that can be a much more specific conversation. But that general advice is relationships and building trust, and doing whatever you can to not break it, because I think that's the thing that really can impair the ability to move forward and to have folks to really, I guess, maintain that trust in moving forward and advancing any of these initiatives that we're hoping can actually kind of be successful.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Megan. That is great advice for a young public servant around, don't just engage when you need something, build trust throughout and maintain that trust. Marilyn, I'm wondering, we have a couple of minutes. Shall we give you the last word on this? What advice would you have for a young public servant who wants to travel on that path of reconciliation and support of Indigenous people and peoples?
My advice. You see how unruly I am? I need to be managed. Would you like a job? I'll hire you. Seriously. I'm back to being a policy consultant on Indigenous policy. I'll give you my cell number and we'll talk. All seriously. I mentor many, mostly non-Indigenous. People that know me know that. I've known this lovely lady forever. She knows I've never lost a human rights case. I pick my fights and I pick them good. Right? So yeah, if it's law, what is your background? Engineering, high tech?
Human rights. I actually work at Indigenous Services Canada in their community
Buddy.
infrastructure and international relations groups.
Thank you. Yes, I'll give you my
Much.
card.
Excellent. Well, So Marilyn, you've indicated the value of mentorship, and it sounds as though we're going to connect after this session as well. So that's wonderful. And in fact, I would invite anyone who's in the in-person audience to do just that. If you'd like to hang around and have a chat with Marilyn or Megan after this session, we'll be here for a little while. But I do note that it is now 2:20. And so I would like to invite my colleague from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, Kayla, to come back to the stage.
Oh my goodness, this is a great session that we had, and I want to give a big chee magwitch to both our virtual audience, but also all the wonderful people who came and registered and sat down and enjoyed today's session. So on behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, also a big thank you to Sherri Helgason, Marilyn Buffalo, and Megan Lewis for joining us here today. Now, to access this video after we conclude, you can just go to the NCTR YouTube channel. The English audio is going to be uploaded directly. After I get back to my hotel room, the French audio will go up. And we'll be working on getting the ASL video up as well. Now tomorrow, join us at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our last virtual Lunch and Learn with special guests Dr. Ava Jewell and residential school survivor Lavinia Brown, who are going to be taking a look at a hard look really at the barriers to addressing reconciliation. Now that conversation is going to be moderated by Cole Kippenhuck. And then don't forget to join the NCTR, APTN, CBC, Radio Canada, and the Algonquin Nation on Monday, September 30th for the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation's national broadcast at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. For those here in Ottawa, come on down to Parliament Hill on the West Block lawn. But you can also watch on television or listen on radio for the 90-minute program, recognizing and honoring residential school survivors and children who never made it home. There's also a 30-minute pre-show being hosted by APTN. And to learn more about the NCTR, about Truth and Reconciliation Week, please visit nctr.ca, as well as trw-svr.nctr.ca, which is the special website we developed for Truth and Reconciliation Week. With that, let's give a big round of applause for our panelists and hosts. And with that, thank you, merci, miigwech, hi, and see you at the next virtual Lunch and Learn.